you. Thank you very much. So, Big Australia, a term which was kindly gifted to us by a relatively recent Prime Minister, but really a population discussion, if nothing else, which has been raging more or less in dark and light terms since the nation became a nation. So it's not a new thing. It's a really interesting debate on the basis that we have effectively two very well argued, very factual bases on each corner of the boxing ring. In the blue corner, we have the scientific climate debate about the pressures that population put on the sustainability of the environment, and the other, a really well-argued research position around economics and the value of growth and how that maintains our global competitiveness and lifestyle. So perhaps a good place to start would be with you, Tim. We know that you probably have possibly a slightly different view to some of those in the audience about population and its impacts. I'd like you just to unpack that a little bit further.
Sure. Yeah, look, I just want to say, I think I came to my first Property Council meeting in Darwin in about 2007. And I remember then the sort of discussions that were happening, and they were very similar, Nicki, to the ones that you presented on then. People saying, we can do this better, we can do it, we can make it all work. Nothing's changed. The only thing that's changed is things have got worse over time. When I was growing up, people bought into the idea of migration and expanding the population because we all benefited from it in a very tangible way. Not only was the economy growing, but the well-being of people in general was growing. We're now in a situation where we have very much larger population growth, as you explained, coming through migration, but the benefits aren't being shared. So economic growth is sluggish. It's about the same as population growth, but most people are going backwards. There's a few who are doing much, much better. So how are they going backwards? Well, let's have a look at Western Sydney as an example. Look at the development in that city. Look at the heat island effect being created by inappropriate development. Large parts of that city, in the face of climate change, are going to become uninhabitable through parts of summer in future. It's just going to be too hot. So easy to fix. Lighter surfaces, tree cover. We can't even do the simple things that make people's lives better. The water quality in Western Sydney, not even monitored. It's so bad the state government isn't monitoring it. So if a kid wants to go for a swim, they can't do it. These are big quality of life issues. The transport issues that you put forward, absolutely true. Housing affordability, a huge one. That's a case where migration is making things worse for the younger generation. Our failure to deal with climate change is making things worse for the younger generation. So we are now in a situation where we have a small but significant number of people for whom the social compact is well and truly broken. They're not buying into it anymore. So if we want to continue growth, what we have to do is honour the things that we've said today to actually make things better. And could I just say one thing? This is not a new problem.
I'm hoping you say more than one.
Okay, good. It's not a new problem. If you go back to the earliest democracies in ancient Greece, they worked because everyone participated. But there was one group of people who didn't, and the Greeks called them the idiotes. It's given us the modern word idiot, but it meant something very different in ancient Greece. What it meant was someone who was so concerned with their own business, they wouldn't engage with the wider social issues. Right? And the reason that we're in the place we're in today is because of the idiotes in our current society who pursue self-interest, which we all do, but to the exclusion of looking at that bigger picture. So we're at a position now, I think, where we have to redistribute the benefits of economic growth across a wider section of society, act on the words that we utter, walk the talk. The Property Council could play a huge role in making life better for so many Australians. You could take a leading role if you wanted in this. Instead of just talking, get out and do it. Don't be the idiotes of the modern age. And secure your own future, because without doing that, ongoing large-scale growth is going to be in question and eventually will be overturned, I believe.
So it becomes an issue of social equity at its core, really. So, John, you've heard a whole range of different introductory presentations, and I know we spoke about this last night as well. Is there a way to reconcile these two positions, I suppose, our reliance on, almost anxiety, if you like, about relying on population growth to underpin the economy and our quality of life, versus clearly scientifically proven impacts that we're having on the environment around us?
So I think we can, but I think we need perhaps a little more precision about some of the things that we're talking about. So we talk about economic growth, and there's no question that migrants increase GDP because they increase the size of the population, therefore your economy is larger. But of course, whilst businesses, if you are a big property developer, if GDP goes up, chances are your profit goes up. But from the point of view of the population, You only care if GDP per capita goes up. And that's a rather more complicated thing. And in particular, you need to see, in effect, productivity growth go up. And if you are bringing a lot of high-skilled migrants to Australia, chances are they are net contributors to productivity. If you are bringing a lot of low-skilled migrants to Australia, that case is harder to make out. Now, in fact, if you look at the reality of Australia's migration statistics, and I've just put them out on Twitter, most migrants to Australia are now low-skilled. They are students, backpackers, and other. And that's not that's effectively the change from year to year. So the population growth we're seeing is dominantly low-skill migration, and the reason for that is essentially the politics are such that the Commonwealth Government makes a big song and dance about how it's reducing permanent migrants, and by and large those are skilled migrants, and it has made no effort to curtail the number of low-skill migrants, which are effectively uncapped programs. And so we've seen this big switch in the Australian migration program from high-skilled migrants to low-skilled migrants.
But that's a productivity case. I mean, another way to look at that would be population growth is population growth, and that does fuel consumption and housing markets and other things like that. Do unskilled migrants still have a role in the future?
Yeah, so that's my point, is that they fuel all of those things. They fuel GDP, but they don't fuel increase in GDP per capita. And if you're asking existing residents, are you happy about these changes? Then from their point of view, they care about GDP per capita, not GDP. Of course, governments care about GDP because so long as the GDP numbers keep going forwards, they can say, oh, look, there's no recession. And that's why you've had an increasing number of people pointing out, look, Australia's in a so-called per capita recession. In fact, GDP per capita has been shrinking for the last 3 quarters. So I think that's one thing that's going on. The second thing that's going on, I think, is there's a really big cost to migration that we haven't spent enough time talking about, which is essentially around the pressure it puts on housing. And whereas we tend to kind of focus on the infrastructure implications of migration, just from a conceptual point of view, it must be true that if I increase the population of Australia by 10%, I do not need 10% more road space. And clearly we haven't built anything like that, and we don't need to. But you do need, roughly speaking, 10% more housing. And when you're running a very rapid migration program, as Australia is, Melbourne at 2.7% growth is one of the fastest growing cities in the developed world. Accommodating that many extra people a year is very hard. By and large, we haven't built enough housing to accommodate it, and the consequence of that is that housing prices have gone up by more than otherwise, and people are really pissed that essentially their children can't afford to buy a home. So I think that's the cost piece we haven't talked about. And then the final point I would make is this. We've talked about what would be good migration policy, which, as Nicki points out, essentially is population policy, assuming we got a whole bunch of policy things right around density and infrastructure and all the rest of it. But that is not the world we are in. The world we are in is one in which the politics of increasing housing density is really, really bad. NIMBYism is here to stay. It's a phenomenon we see in pretty much every city in the developed world, and overturning it is really hard. And it's worth remembering that a lot of the increase in density in Sydney happened more or less by accident rather than by deliberate policy shifts. So housing's really hard, infrastructure's really hard, because it doesn't matter how many fantastic pieces of work Romilly puts out. The bottom line is the politicians overwhelmingly promise things in elections, and because they promise them in elections, they then do them well before a business case has been prepared. And again, I've tweeted out, you can see that pattern in the last Commonwealth election, the last New South Wales election, the last Victorian election. Politicians just ignore the work that's been done, by and large.
And there's a link in there to the NIMBYism theme, and Nicki picked up on that. Nicki, this is a very difficult issue for policymakers, difficult issue for the property industry and for a whole range of different markets to deal with density in cities, density done well, if you like. To what degree is this really just about an anti-change agenda or a grassroots movement about fear of change in communities? And is it about better community engagement, or is there something else we can be doing?
Better community engagement and education, I think, is the key to this. I mean, as I said before, population is coming, and you can slow down migration to a certain extent, but we're not going to go backwards. Our cities will continue to grow, and at some point, whether it's in 10 years or 20 years, Sydney and Melbourne will get to that 8 million figure, and we need to actually accommodate it. And a lot of people say, well, we should grow our regional centres, but there aren't the right jobs there. Just because we haven't done it right up till now doesn't mean we can't. But it will take huge political will, and I wonder how that will happen. If we think about the disparity between local government and state government, for example, on planning laws, I mean, we know, even if you don't believe Peter Chillip's modelling from the Reserve Bank about how much poor zoning decisions cost housing in price terms, there is still an impact.